interrupt this program to give you a bulletin just received from one of our naval units at sea. A large object traveling at supersonic speed is headed over the North Atlantic toward the east coast of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Drew Pearson. We bring you this special radio television broadcast in order to give you the very latest information on an amazing phenomenon, the arrival of a space ship in Washington. The Army has taken every precaution to meet any emergency which may develop. Just a minute, ladies and gentlemen, I think something is happening.
I came here to give you these facts. But if you threaten to extend your violence, this earth of yours will be reduced to a burned-out cinder.
But he's a robot. Without you, what could he do?
There's no limit to what he could do. He could destroy the earth.
All vehicles, close in. Let's go.
To add some authenticity to the 1951 science fiction film, The Day the Earth Stood Still. At the time, Pearson was a nationally famous radio commentator and also a daily syndicated newspaper columnist. His column was called The Washington Merry-Go-Round and appeared in more than 600 newspapers in the United States and abroad. Drew Pearson served as a link between the muckrakers of the Progressive era and the Watergate investigative reporters. His willingness to break secrets and reveal what was really happening behind closed doors ruined countless days for members of Congress and drove several presidents to apoplexy. Going back to the recent talk about fake news, my own research has sought to determine the accuracy of his exposés for readers at the time and for researchers today. First, I ought to answer the question, how is it that a Senate historian comes to write a book about a newspaper columnist? Well, when the U.S. Senate first considered creating an historical office, it contemplated making us a public information office. Then it thought twice and decided that every senator was going to be their own public information officer. But of course, it was a 200-year-old institution that operated on precedent, so many of the questions that came in were historical questions. And when we historians were questioned, we tried to stick to the past and place current events into historical perspective. The media eventually determined that we were a neutral, fact-driven institution, and they labeled us straight shooters, and they became more calling more frequently. The 1 year that I tried to keep track, I logged in phone calls from 331 different reporters, columnists, broadcasters, and fact-checkers. As I was being questioned, I grew interested in how reporters got their news and how accurate that news was. After all, as an historian, I was citing newspaper articles in my footnotes. Did I know who wrote them? And could I trust how accurate they were? So those questions led to my writing two books, one about the 19th century called Press Gallery, Congress and the Washington Correspondence, and another about the 20th century called Reporting from Washington, The History of the Washington Press Corps. Drew Pearson, being a connecting link, appeared in both books. When I retired from the Senate, Pearson's stepson, Tyler Abel, urged me to write a book about the columnist. He said that his name had faded essentially from the public memory in the half century since his death. In fact, if you Google the name Drew Pearson, you'll learn a lot more about the Dallas Cowboys wide receiver than about the journalist. The future football player's parents had actually named him after their favorite newspaper columnist. Tyler Abel offered me a complete access to Pearson's papers and diaries and took me up into the hayloft of his barn and pulled off a tarpaulin to show several file cabinets filled with documents that had not been previously made available. He also offered access to an oral history project that he'd conducted with the Pearson family members and staff, and he pledged not to try to shape my interpretation in any way. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. The chief drawback to writing about Drew Pearson was that the bulk of his papers are at the LBJ Library in Texas, and despite having been there for a half century, they're not fully processed yet. I spent some time in Texas, but the saving grace for me came when Pearson's former secretary arrived to do her oral history and brought with her 2 large archival boxes. These were filled with documents that Drew Pearson had personally culled from his massive manuscript collection to write a memoir that he never completed. And those documents, which he considered the most important, then served as a shortcut through the rest of his collection. And then there were all those columns that he wrote between 1932 and his death in 1969. It was a daily column, including weekends and holidays. All of these collected columns amount to about 50,000 pages of material, and they are all online at the American University's digital archives. As someone who started out doing research on brittle newsprint and cranking through reels of microfilm, it was astonishing to be able to access all of this material on my home computer. Now, as I read through the material, it became clear that for all his stature and prominence, Drew Pearson had made some powerful detractors. Herbert Hoover had tried to get him fired. FDR had called him a chronic liar. Harry Truman sent the FBI to investigate him. Dwight Eisenhower ostensibly ignored him and sent his press secretary to trash him. John F. Kennedy lamented that all the powers of the presidency, he was unable to control the columnist. LBJ did his best to co-opt him, and Nixon put him at the top of his enemies list. And then to register some international perspective on all this, Winston Churchill once dubbed Drew Pearson the most colossal liar in the United States. So tracking down all of these accusations, I discovered a pattern. Pearson certainly made his share of mistakes, usually through haste or misunderstanding. And sometimes the people who leaked to him were less than honest about their intentions. But I never found an instance where Pearson knowingly lied. Instead, it was his accusers who lied regularly to cover their own tracks. Raised as a Quaker, Drew Pearson regarded truth-seeking as both a moral obligation and a self-defense mechanism. He was sued for libel at least 120 times, more than any other journalist, and he won every case except for one. And that one he would have tried to appeal, except his lawyer said it would be cheaper to settle it out of court. The way he won all those cases was by demonstrating that the information he had written about was true. The one case that he lost in this case, even his opponent's lawyers thought that Pearson had made a better argument. The courts didn't believe that, though. So how does an historian prove whether an accusation is true or not? The passage of a half century since Pearson's death has opened massive federal records that have shown what was really happening behind those closed doors within the federal government. For instance, there are 1,000 pages of FBI records now open at the National Archives about Drew Pearson. They demonstrated the arc of Pearson's relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, from friendship to animosity. In the 1930s, the Washington Merry-Go-Round column promoted Hoover as a super G-man, and he returned the favor by providing information and authorizing FBI agents to review some of the columns in advance to fact-check them. And then also the FBI began to launch investigations into some of the allegations that Pearson was making. When Harry Truman ordered the FBI to tap Pearson's phones, Hoover alerted the columnist in advance, adding, "You know how Harry is." Pearson used to joke that he had so many listeners on his telephone conversations that he could have sold commercials. When government agencies asked the FBI to track down the leakers to Pearson's column, J. Edgar Hoover advised them just to do a better job with securing their own secrets. Eventually, Pearson and Hoover fell out during the Red Scare. And during the Cold War, a correspondent for the Soviet newspaper Pravda told Pearson that the Soviet embassy staff in Washington wanted to know how Pearson could get away with writing all those things about J. Edgar Hoover and still stay in business. Pearson conceded that he would have stood no chance against the secret police in Moscow if he'd been a Russian. After the column took a stance against Senator Joseph McCarthy, Pearson's friendship with Hoover had ended. And the FBI files were filled with lots of really nasty comments that Hoover used to write in the columns and the memos about Drew Pearson. The FBI cut off Pearson from its information, except occasionally when the Bureau still found it useful to leak something to them.
Yes.
Another government agency whose historical records I found rewarding was the U.S. State Department. Drew Pearson had started as a diplomatic correspondent and always kept a close eye on the Foreign Service. He collected so much information about the State Department that Secretary of State Cordell Hull once began a meeting by asking, "Are we talking for this room or for Pearson?" The columnist benefited from sources high and low within the State Department, but particularly from Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, who was a close friend and confidant. The Washington merry-go-round promoted Welles's career, and he provided information and also confirmed news that Pearson had picked up elsewhere. The trouble was that the column grew so favorable to Welles that Secretary Hull began to blame him for all of the leaks and eventually had him fired. In fact, Drew Pearson had plenty of sources within the State Department. One was the director of the State Department's Office of Special Political Affairs, Alger Hiss. Indeed, when Hiss's colleagues worried about him leaking, it was not to the Soviet Union, but to Drew Pearson. Some of Pearson's columns clearly originated in classified U.S. military information about the British actions. Several departments received copies of those reports, and Hiss's was one of them. Hiss always denied being the source, but investigators observed that Pearson's legmen were regularly visiting Hiss's office. Now, legmen were a squad of younger reporters that Pearson hired to go out and patrol the halls of government to sweep up any kind of news items for him. The most prominent of these legmen was Jack Anderson, who eventually inherited the column. Drew Pearson knew that the State Department was a hotbed of gossip and rumor. Foreign Service officers routinely cultivated friendships to gather private information about local affairs, and they continued to do so when they came back to Washington. They handled state secrets casually. Noel Field, who was a U.S. Foreign Service officer who was also secretly spying for the Soviet Union, said he benefited by the department's careless records management. Fields called the mentality of the State Department rather provincial in those days and attested that, quote, the most secret documents, sometimes in multiple copies, circulated from hand to hand. As a researcher, I could consult the State Department's Foreign Relations series, the FRUS, their official documentary records. And whenever the merry-go-round would make an accusation, I could look back to see what FRUS had recorded about it. So in the instance of a case just before World War II, the merry-go-round revealed that pro-Nazi sentiments within the State Department had authorized the sale of helium for German dirigibles in violation of the U.S. Neutrality Act. Secretary of State Hull devoted a full hour at his press conferences to denouncing that accusation and denying it. But Frus makes it quite clear that Pearson got the story right. And when Pearson wrote about anti-Russian attitudes in the State Department during World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt called him a chronic liar, not wanting to upset the Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union at the time. And yet, if you read through Frus, you can see the anti-Russian sentiments that were building up within the State Department and worries about the Soviets' post-war intentions. I also benefited from a brief announcement in the American Historical Association's newsletter, Perspectives, that said for a month, the Churchill archives online was going to be made free to AHA members. So I signed up and I went on and typed in Drew Pearson, and up popped a half a dozen, at least, memorandum from Churchill, furious, totally outraged about the fact that some of his top secret telegrams were appearing verbatim in the Washington Merry-Go-Round. If Pearson had operated out of London, he would have violated the Official Secrets Act and been prosecuted. But in Washington, he was protected by the First Amendment. In 1944, the column revealed that Churchill had ordered a British commander in Greece to suppress public protests in Athens and not to hesitate to fire openly on the demonstrators. As I tracked this story back, it turned out that Churchill himself bore responsibility for the leak. He had dictated the cable so late at night that his exhausted secretary had typed top secret at the top, but had forgotten to type guard, which was the signal that this message should not be shown to the Americans. So instead, it went out through American channels, and American officials were offended by the thought that U.S. Lend-Lease tanks might be used against Greek civilians, and they leaked the document to the columnist. Now, Pearson broke secrets throughout his career, even during wartime. He had to outmaneuver censors, diplomats, military brass, and spies. But when he was accused once of having revealed classified information, he actually sued that it was a defamation. It made him appear unpatriotic. At the trial, he testified that the word classified had become extraordinarily broad, and the government was using it to cover a multitude of sins, things that they didn't want the public to know about. He insisted that a diligent reporter had to determine for himself whether something marked classified should be published. But Pearson didn't reveal everything that he knew. For instance, he learned about the development of atomic bombs months before Hiroshima. In a radio broadcast, he hinted at what he knew, predicting to his audience that Japan would develop a desire for peace before the end of 1945. I can't go beyond that, he added, except to say that when peace with Japan comes, it will come just as suddenly and unexpectedly as Pearl Harbor. And early in the Cold War, Pearson also learned that American cryptographers were trying to crack a Soviet code for documents that they had collected during World War II, communications between Soviet agents in the United States and Moscow. This was known as Project Winona. You and I didn't learn about Project Winona until 1995. Pearson knew about it in 1951. And the reason we know that is because a British intelligence agent notified the FBI that the columnist knew that Arlington Hall has not been able to break a Russian code. Now, Pearson never divulged that, but it didn't actually protect that secret from the Soviets, because the British intelligence agent who notified the FBI was Kim Philby, who himself was a double agent for the Soviets. Drew Pearson was a liberal Democrat who gave basically grief to presidents of both parties. He originally supported Dwight Eisenhower for president, but became disillusioned with him when he felt that Eisenhower's response to McCarthy was too weak. And it was about Eisenhower that Drew Pearson made one of the larger mistakes of his career, at least he thought so. And that was a week before the presidential election of 1956, one in which Democrats had made Eisenhower's health a major issue. The Merry-Go-Round reported that Eisenhower had collapsed on the campaign trail, and that his motorcade, his limousine, had pulled out of the motorcade and rushed to the next stop, to the airport, where he flew to the next city, and then he sequestered himself for 24 hours in a hotel suite, not seeing anyone except for his family and his doctor. Eisenhower's press secretary, Jim Haggerty, denounced this as a complete fabrication. He showed the Washington Press Corps pictures of the motorcade and showed that Eisenhower's limousine had not pulled out, and he insisted that Eisenhower had kept up his schedule as planned the next day. In fact of the matter, it was Jim Haggerty who was misleading the press corps. Eisenhower's own doctor's notes are available at the Eisenhower Library. And his doctor said that Eisenhower had retreated to his hotel room, exhausted and suffering from high blood pressure. The doctor said he was emotionally upset because of the exhaustion of these days and the prospect of requirements for days to come. So although Pearson had gotten some of the details wrong on the story, he'd gotten the gist of it correct. He also didn't aim his fire exclusively at presidents. He made life pretty difficult for members of Congress as well. He had Capitol Hill riddled with people who were willing to overhear conversations and report back to him about that. He claimed credit for having caused the indictment, imprisonment, censure of at least a half a dozen members of Congress and the political defeats of many more of them. It might not have been so bad for members of the Congress if Drew Pearson column had only appeared in the Washington Post. But it was syndicated in 600 newspapers, which meant that their constituents back home were getting a chance to read it. Among the members of Congress that Pearson was most ferocious in leveling his fire at was Senator Joseph McCarthy, who became a regular target of the column. Jack Anderson, Pearson's leg man, complained to Pearson when they started doing this. He said, McCarthy is one of our best sources on Capitol Hill. And Pearson responded, he may be a good source, Jack, but he's a bad man. Pearson totally disagreed with McCarthy's anti-communist crusade, and he felt that McCarthy's charges were groundless and that he was ruining people's lives in the process. And so the column kept up a drumbeat of critical reporting on McCarthy. This so outraged Senator McCarthy that one night after a dinner dance at Washington's Swank Soulgrave Club, McCarthy met Pearson in the cloakroom of the Soulgrave Club, pinned his arms, kicked him, and slapped him viciously. The fight was actually broken up by California's new Senator Richard Nixon, who arrived to separate the two. And afterwards, Nixon used to tell this story and say that he thought he saved Pearson's life at that night. And he said, and do you think it ever did me any good with that bastard Pearson? Never. After beating up Drew Pearson, Joe McCarthy rose on the Senate floor several days later and accused him of being a communist puppet. The senator called on Americans to boycott Pearson's radio sponsor, Adam Hatz, and the sponsor indeed caved and dropped the program. That cost Pearson half of his income. But it was the Washington merry-go-round that undid Joe McCarthy. It started by revealing that one of McCarthy's aides, G. David Schein, had dodged the draft, which prompted Army doctors to reclassify him. Next, the column revealed that another McCarthy staffer, Roy Cohen, was demanding weekend passes and other special treatment for Private Schein. McCarthy at the time was investigating the Army Signal Corps. The Army claimed that he was prolonging the investigation to blackmail it into special treatment for Private Schein. McCarthy counteracted that the Army was holding Schein hostage to make him stop his investigation. As a result, the Senate held their televised Army McCarthy hearings. And this gave the nation the chance to see for themselves the type of actions and the behavior of Senator McCarthy that Drew Pearson had been reporting on in his column. No other journalist, not even Edward R. Murrow, who usually gets the credit, but no other journalist contributed as much to Joseph McCarthy's undoing. Drew Pearson spent 4 decades making allies among the highest levels of the government and pursuing tips from some of the lowest level whistleblowers and civil servants and anonymous informants. He knew that leakers often had ulterior motives, but he did his best to try to verify the information that they were providing him. His column contained news that the rest of the Washington press corps either missed or had been unable to persuade their editors to publish. Readers' polls confirmed that Drew Pearson was the nation's best-known columnist. A poll of Washington journalists rated him as the Washington correspondent who exerted the greatest influence on the nation, giving him twice the votes they gave to Walter Lippmann. Even his most outspoken critics credited him with being virtually a government within the government with his own corps of agents. Now, newspaper editors often trimmed the column or dropped it entirely for a day if they were worried about something that Pearson wrote. They're afraid about being sued, perhaps. But unlike investigative reporters who worked for a particular newspaper or a particular news agency, and who ran the risk of exhausting their editors or their publishers' patience or their budgets, Drew Pearson appeared in so many different newspapers that no single editor or publisher could curtail him. The column's liberal leanings discomforted its conservative subscribers, who suspected that Pearson's views might distort his reporting to fit his ideological bias. They sometimes published the column with disclaimers that its views did not necessarily match their own. The Washington Post grew so nervous about the merry-go-round column that they kept moving the column further and further back into the newspaper, away from the editorial pages, until it wound up among the comic strips. And that's where many of us remember reading Drew Pearson. But Pearson himself professed not to mind because he reasoned that far more people read the comics than read the editorials. In sum, Drew Pearson's career demonstrates the power of political journalism. His reporting influenced public opinion, influenced voters, influenced public officials, and influenced public policy. The rest of the press corps, the Washington press corps, even though they resented Pearson, respected much of the news that he was putting out. A group of reporters were once having lunch at the National Press Club, and they were complaining about Drew Pearson and his columns and his elbowing his way to the front of the stories and claiming that some of his reporting was factually shaky. And one of them finally spoke up and said, "Let's face it, not one of us here would have the nerve to write what Pearson does or hope to get it printed." The others agreed that they read the column because they could never tell when it was going to cover the story of the day coming out of Washington. And at times, while his exposés would sometimes meet with indifference from the rest of the press corps, at other times his scoops caught everyone's attention and encouraged the rest of the pack to join in the pursuit. Editors at the Washington Post described his technique as scattershot, sometimes right on target, and other times missing it altogether. It seemed to them as if it was a conscious strategy, a readiness to risk being wrong now and then as a necessity for becoming the necessary price for being right more often. And my research has convinced me that Drew Pearson was more often right, and that he performed a valuable public service as a national watchdog. We need more like him. Thank you very much.
John, that was amazing. So fascinating and so well researched. Thank you so much. Yes, you're getting a lot of claps from the audience. We do have a few questions. For those of you that might have joined us a little bit late, we're going to be giving John questions through the chat function. So if you have a question on the presentation, please put it in the chat function. So Don, our first question is from Mike Rice. The question is, since Pearson might have had a kind of quote unquote Washington confidential reputation, Mike is curious as to Pearson's views on A, the idea of journalism as the first draft of history, as presented in Shearer, Murrow, Teddy, White, and part B, I.F. Stone's type of work, which focused on agencies' own little-known but public documents in the interest of liberal advocacy.
Yes, well, the first draft of history was a phrase coined by Phil Graham, the editor of the Washington Post, publisher of the Washington Post. And I think Pearson would definitely have agreed with that. He wasn't just a newspaper columnist and just a radio correspondent. He also published a number of books during his career. And he did feel that his reporting was going to be useful for historians. And in 1949, he started keeping a diary, I think also thinking about how history would want to record. The diary often included things that didn't appear in the column, and often it gave indication as to where he got the information from. 2 volumes of the diaries have been published, and I was able to look at the rest of the diaries in between. And so I think Pearson understood that he was contributing to history. And by the way, anybody can go to American University's digital archives and look at any of Pearson's columns from 1932 to 1969. It's quite remarkable. And in fact, if you're looking for juicy anecdotes and colorful quotes and real inside scoops about what was happening at the time from that time period, I think everyone would benefit by that. The second half of that question was,
one second, let me get back up there. I think Mike's question was, what is that in comparison to I.F.
Stone? Right.
Right.
That's right. And I.F. Stone and Pearson knew each other. They admired each other. Although in the 60s, they split apart over Vietnam. Pearson, despite his skepticism about Vietnam, supported Lyndon Johnson. And I.F. Stone kept urging him to come out more vehemently against the war. But they both were interested in that kind of information that other people overlooked. I.F. Stone was very hard of hearing and also very nearsighted. And when he went to hearings, he complained that he missed things. So he actually used to read the hearing transcripts after the meetings. He was one of the only reporters who did that. He picked up all sorts of things that the rest of the press corps missed. And he was quite accurate because he was quoting the government back at each other. And so he was doing for himself what Pearson's legmen were doing, running around the halls. And in fact, one thing that Jack Anderson discovered was that in 1947, Congress authorized its committees or mandated its committees to make transcripts of their closed sessions. They just didn't release them. But he could always persuade some useful member of Congress to slip him a copy of the transcript so he could find out what was going on. And Jack Anderson discovered that Senator John Kennedy was quite willing to provide the closed hearings from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee so that they could see actually what was said in those closed hearings. Yes, there is a certain affinity between Stone and Pearson. Pearson was much more popular in his approach and not quite as ideologically strong as I.F. Stone.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Max Holland. Were you able to determine the sources for his more important stories? Did he rely on single sources or try to corroborate the initial source? Were any of these sources surprising? And he has in parentheses, along the lines of John Stennis being a major source for Seymour Hersh.
Yeah. Pearson used to describe his source collecting like the FBI. He said, a story comes in and by itself, it doesn't mean very much. And so you hold on to it. A second source comes in and you add to it. And you pick up another piece of information. Eventually, you begin to see what the picture is and you start going out looking for information. He had sources all over the place. He had sources inside the Supreme Court. He was good friends with several justices of the court, including 2 Chief Justices, Fred Vinson and with Earl Warren. He had members of the cabinet were providing him information about what was going on. In fact, he got so much information out of Harry Truman's cabinet that Truman made the FBI sweep the room to make sure there wasn't a microphone in there. And so Tom Clark, who actually as Attorney General had some supervision over the FBI, was one of the biggest leakers that Pearson had at the time. Sometimes the leakers were small fry. They were quite often they were military officers. There's a lot of inter-service rivalry. So if you want to know about the Army, you ask the Navy and vice versa. And in some cases, it was military officers who felt that something was going on that the public needed to know about. So it was an Army colonel who leaked to Pearson the material about General McArthur in Korea, that McArthur had ignored the intelligence reports that the Chinese were building up on the Yalu River and had moved forward at that point. So it was a source within the Pentagon. And sometimes when government agents would come to quiz Pearson about his sources, he would look at them and smile and say, my sources were at the top level of your agency. So, in other words, your boss leaked this to me.
Amazing. All right. Our next question is from Catherine Miller. She says on Wikipedia, there's a claim Pearson worked with the Eisenhower staff to publish information on Joe McCarthy. Have you found any evidence of that? And she has a second question. Do you feel anything Pearson wrote had an impact on later policies, i.e. public outcry that later led to any change in laws?
In terms of the second one, yes, that definitely many of his issues eventually were enacted into law. In fact, Ralph Nader credited the column with saying that when he would start to print it and get public opinion behind something, it created an aura of inevitability to some of the movements that he was dealing with. And so sometimes he initiated things, sometimes people came to him with issues that he promoted in the column, and he certainly carried that on. In terms of the Eisenhower people, he was clearly getting information from the Eisenhower folks in some cases, and that was the way he was able to document that Roy Cohn was calling the Army constantly to tell them that McCarthy wanted special favors for G. David Schein. Well, the reason he knew that was because the Army's chief counsel had kept a log of all of Cohen's telephone conversations, and so that was clearly leaked to the column. And Pearson was always he was willing to do things that other reporters weren't willing to do. So other reporters got this information from the Eisenhower administration. They just sat on it for a while until somebody else broke the story, and then it wasn't it wasn't a libelous issue anymore. One thing that would certainly happen was that many newspapers just wouldn't publish it until some congressman stood up and introduced the Washington merry-go-round into the congressional record, in which case they could quote the congressional record, and that would free them from the possibility of being sued for libel on those occasions. So yes, there's definitely a lot of support. You know, even though FDR called Pearson a chronic liar, FDR himself leaked to Pearson. And there's a wonderful story about one day Roosevelt was mad about leaks coming out of his administration. He called his staff together and he said, "No more leaks under any circumstances." And one of the staff said, "Well, you know, there is that story that you wanted to get out so that we could test the congressional reaction to it." And FDR said, "Oh, you're right. That you can leak that story to Pearson." And the staff member said, "I already have." So that's the kind of sources, quite amazing sources. But because people knew that that was a way to get out and not to have the story attributed to them.
Excellent. Our next question is from Pat Harahan. Pat, good to see you joining us today. Was there a link between Drew Pearson and the earlier reports called the Muckrakers?
Yes. In the book, I talk about the Muckrakers and what distinguished them. They were, during the Progressive era, they were, for the most part, New York journalists, magazine writers, who would rush into Washington and write their exposés and then go back to New York. And of course, the Washington reporters who were here collecting news on a daily basis, they basically couldn't defend their sources. So they often suppressed stories that the New York magazine writers were quite willing to publish. And the whole idea of muckraking faded with the Progressive era at the end. There were a couple in the 1920s who investigated the Teapot Dome scandal, for instance. But Pearson and his partner, Robert Allen, really modeled their column initially on the old-time muckrakers and tried to keep that spirit alive. And for a long time, Pearson was the biggest investigative reporter in Washington. And after he died in 1969, and of course, Watergate followed, and then investigative reporting became much more widespread, and they began to win all sorts of awards. Pearson was quite often nominated for Pulitzer Prizes, but they never gave him one. He was too much of a rule breaker for the rest of the press corps.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from Judson McClary. Hi, Judson. Pearson reported on a lot of public figures, but Judson's question is, did he also investigate and expose actions of federal agencies as well as individuals?
Oh yes, he investigated everybody, and he was looking into the regulatory commissions back in the 1950s, and a lot of the clearly that there was a lot of quid pro quo going on of regulators who were willing to extend licenses to people in terms of being paid for what was going on. And as he worked his way up the chain, he realized that the person who was really in the middle of all of this was the president's own personal chief of staff, and that was Sherman Adams. Eisenhower relied enormously on Sherman Adams, and all during Eisenhower's illnesses, Adams was essentially the acting president. But it turns out that Adams had his finger in a lot of pie in Washington. And eventually, the Washington Merry-Go-Round published enough of an expose that Eisenhower, to his great regret, had to fire Sherman Adams. Then I discovered that, and this is through an historian at Gettysburg, Michael Berkner, found out that afterwards, the Kennedy Justice Department continued to look into Pearson's allegations, found out that Adams, his behavior was even worse than Pearson had said. He'd been collecting a lot of money from private sources, and they threatened to file a major income tax case against Sherman Adams. Former President Eisenhower was so upset that he sent word to President Kennedy that he asked that the Justice Department not prosecute his former chief of staff. John F. Kennedy wanted Dwight Eisenhower to be indebted to him, and so he ordered his brother, who was the Attorney General, to drop the case. And his brother said that would be wrong. And John Kennedy said, "Which one of us was elected president?" So there's a lot of interesting stories in there with in terms of other agencies, and also it wasn't just Washington D.C. Pearson had people all over the country who were telephoning him tips. He had regular people that he would check in with, newspaper editors, lawyers, politicians in different states. Pat Brown in California was constantly leaking, especially after he lost to Ronald Reagan, continued to leak about Ronald Reagan's administration to Pearson. And so quite often the columns dealt with particular states. And in one case, in 1939, a former governor of Louisiana showed up on Pearson's doorstep with evidence that the current governor was corrupt and that they were taking money from the WPA for private uses in the state of Louisiana. And Pearson's columns then exposed the situation. Not only did the governor of Louisiana go to jail, but so did the president of LSU go to jail as a result, and the head of the WPA in Louisiana. So there were a lot of local issues as well as national issues that were, and a lot of things about agencies that much of which I couldn't cover in not only in the speech, but not even in the book I couldn't cover because there was so much going on in that column.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And books are we never have enough room in books. This is what happens. We have to make choices. Our next question is from Todd Bennett. He would like for you to talk a little bit about Pearson's relationship with Jack Anderson and how the handoff of the column worked, and did they have the same journalistic commitment to the truth?
Yeah, Jack Anderson was Drew Pearson's protege in many ways. He showed up in 1947 to interview for a job. There was an opening on Pearson's staff. He was a very young reporter with not a lot of experience, but he was energetic, determined, and willing to work for a very small salary. And Pearson was a notorious penny pincher. People who worked for him really never got large salaries. Most of them had other jobs to help sustain them during that period, but they felt committed and they stayed with him for years. And Anderson was just a determined reporter. The good thing for Anderson initially was that nobody knew who he was. So that if Drew Pearson showed up at a senator's office, there was a huge commotion. If Jack Anderson showed up, nobody knew who he was, and it didn't make that much difference. It was a lot easier to pick up secrets that way. Anderson became a public figure for the first time really in 1959. It was during the Sherman Adams investigation. Anderson and a congressional staffer rented a hotel room next to Bernard Goldfein, the person who was providing funds to Sherman Adams, next to his hotel room, and put a microphone with a tape recorder right next to the door. Unfortunately for them, the Goldfein people figured this out, called a press conference in Goldfein's office, stuck a coat hanger under the door and pulled the microphone through, and then banged on the door until Anderson and the staff member came out. And poor Anderson was quite embarrassed about that. But he said, everybody knew that Pearson was sort of a keyhole peeper, and this just sort of proved that he was. So it wasn't quite that bad, but his name at that point became much more well known. And he began to share a byline with Pearson. He would write the column whenever Pearson was out of town. And eventually he was going to take over the column. There was never a formal agreement between them. And it was Pearson's column. He was very reluctant to give up any credit for it. But if you remember in the 1960s, Pearson went after Senator Tom Dodd of Connecticut and wrote 100 columns on Tom Dodd. And eventually Dodd was censured and defeated as a senator, really due to Pearson's initiative. But of those 100 columns, Jack Anderson wrote 98 of them. So Anderson was really digging up the materials that Pearson was going to do. And Drew Pearson's secretary said that of the two, that Jack Anderson was really more of a reporter because he would write a story about his own wife if he discovered it. Whereas Pearson's main objective was he wanted to make a better world. And there were certain things that Pearson wasn't going to write and held back. And eventually Jack Anderson took over the column, won a Pulitzer Prize, but got into a lot of trouble for stepping over the line and reporting things that he didn't have really accurate information about. So his career ended in a much shakier situation than Pearson's did.
Thank you. Next question is from Daniel Ernst. Can you generalize about when Pearson decided that a leak, say from someone in a federal agency, was just an intramural squabble versus when it was something of actual public note that he would then use?
Well, intramural squabbles were made good press, actually. So he was always, especially during the New Deal, there were always fights between different New Deal advisors. And so it was just great because one would leak to the other and they'd back and forth. And both sides had a point of view but he was including that in there. Some of these stories never went anywhere. They were nice, they were funny, they were interesting, they shed light on a particular person or a particular moment, and then they were over with, and nobody remembered them a couple of days later. Some of those stories became big issues because government agencies started to step in and look into what the truth was to the matter, and people went to jail as a result of these columns. One of the more prominent people that went to jail was the head of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Parnell Thomas, who had sent the Hollywood 10 to jail for not answering questions at his hearings. Well, Parnell Thomas had a secretary who was very fond of him. And she was quite jealous of the fact that he was driving home a young typist at the office. And she followed them one night and stopped in front of the woman's apartment and came back the next morning and found the congressman's car still parked there, put her hand on the hood and it was cold. And so she leaked information to Drew Pearson that the congressman was taking kickbacks from staff members in his office. And he went to jail. He wound up at the same jail in Danforth, Connecticut, that some of the Hollywood 10 prisoners were there. If you've seen the movie about Dalton Trumbull, there's a moment in which Trumbull meets with the former congressman at that point. It was Drew Pearson's column that started that. So that was the case of a secretary who was spurned, who leaked this information. But Pearson always had, when he got these stories in, he would do his best to verify it, to get his legmen to go out. Quite often the legmen were going out to try to find evidence to support something that Pearson suspected. And the point was he wouldn't publish it until he was pretty sure that he could prove that most of it was accurate. There were cases where people would tell him things at the dinner table, but they certainly weren't going to testify about it in court. And so he would have to then try to find some other sources. And some stories just didn't go anywhere. His diaries are full of suppositions that he's following that don't lead to columns. So he was pretty careful in the end, because he, as I said, he was sued 120 times. And he had to be sure that if he was sued, that he had the evidence to support his case. He kept every paper, by the way, that he ever touched, which is the reason he has this enormous manuscript collection. And it's not surprising that it's taken the LBJ Library 50 years to process it.
Yeah, were the diaries, were they notebook format, or how many of those exist? I mean, I'm sure it's...
Oh, he did them almost every day from 1949 to 1969. 2 very thick volumes have been published, and you could publish at least probably another thick volume with the parts that weren't included in the first 2. The first 2, the diaries that have been published, are very worthwhile reading. I recommend them highly.
Well, there's another tip for everyone. So I have 2 more questions in the chat, and we have a few more minutes. If anyone has a last minute question, this is your time to get it in there. So Don, this is from Mary Jo Binker. Did Pearson have any relationship with Walter Winchell, or was Winchell too much of a gossip columnist?
No, they were good friends for a while. And in fact, Winchell had the even bigger column. It was a Broadway gossip column that was mostly Winchell's was mostly about sex and romance and divorce and Hollywood and Broadway. Very little of that. Pearson didn't write about sex scandals for the most part in the Washington Merry-Go-Round. But if Pearson came across a really good story, he would send it up to Walter Winchell, and Winchell would publish it in his column along the way. So, for instance, during World War II, Pearson learned that a columnist for the Washington Times-Herald, Inga Arvad, was having an affair with one of Joseph Kennedy's sons, and that Joseph Kennedy was quite perturbed because Inga Arvad was getting a divorce. She wanted to marry this son. Turned out it was John Kennedy. And that's one reason why John Kennedy went to the South Pacific, so that he was away from Inga Arvad in Washington. This was a story that Pearson picked up and Pearson sent to Walter Winchell. Eventually, they fell out over McCarthy. Pearson became a ferocious opponent of McCarthy's. Winchell became a great supporter, a cheerleader for McCarthy, and eventually destroyed Winchell's career. But their friendship fell apart as a result of that.
Thank you. Interesting. Okay, I have one last question. If anyone has one more, this is your chance. So another question from Catherine Miller, who also says, thank you so much. She's working on her thesis and looks forward to using the book this summer. Her question is, what were Pearson's thoughts on nuclear weapons, and did that change over time, or did he really not think much about nuclear weapons and nuclear policy?
There's not a lot. He was a Cold Warrior to some degree, and he thought he bought the cover story that came out that the intelligence agencies were putting out that there was a missile gap in the 1950s, and he actually has a book called "Is America a Second-Class State Now?" So he was not anti-nuclear, but he was a Quaker, and at heart he was a pacifist, and he made exceptions. He thought the Korean War he supported World War II. He supported the Korean War. He was very dubious about Vietnam. And the only reason he supported Vietnam was because Lyndon Johnson really twisted his arm and actually made him feel like, for the first time in his career, like an insider in the White House. And he was very reluctant to lose that status. But he didn't write a lot about a nuclear threat. He was really writing more about the strength of the nation in defending itself. And in that sense, I think he was fairly in the mainstream of the way people in Washington operated in those days. It took a long time for people to realize how precarious the world was with this proliferation of nuclear weapons. But quite frankly, that was not an issue that I followed. And so I'd have to go back and take another look to see how much he wrote about this. I just said he knew that we had nuclear weapons before we dropped them on Hiroshima, and he certainly made no objection to using those as a military weapon during the war.
All right. Well, I have received no more questions, but you were getting a lot of thank yous and accolades for a fantastic presentation and a very interesting topic. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the Society for talking to us today. This was absolutely fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to reading this book. I learned a lot today about Drew Pearson, and I'm sure everyone did.
Thank you very much. And, I recognize most of the names of the people who are asking questions. And my only regret is we can't be doing this in person. So I look forward to our getting back together again and holding in-person meetings. But
yes.
In the meantime, this has certainly been a very nice opportunity. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Drew Pearson.
Yeah, well, we're excited for the book to come out. Everyone will rush out and buy it. And our next talk will be on Thursday instead of a Friday. It will be March 4th, and Jim Siekmeyer will present on Before the Opioid Epidemic, the historical origins of the war on drugs in the Andes. So I hope many of you can join us. And again, Don, thank you so much. This was a wonderful way to kick off this colloquium series. And thank you so much, everyone. And it's really good to see some of your faces. It's been too long. As Don said, we will see each other in person as soon as we can make that possible. So everyone stay safe, and thank you so much for joining us.